I'm completely different off the court than I am on the court, and that's something a lot of people don't fully understand unless they've lived that life or competed at a high level themselves. Off the court, I can be calm, relaxed, even quiet at times, just a normal person going about my day. But the second I step between those lines, everything changes. There's a switch that flips, a mindset that takes over, and it's all about competing at the highest level possible. It's not personal. It's not emotional in the way people think. It's just pure competitive fire. When you're out there, you're not thinking about anything else except winning. You're not worried about friendships, narratives, or outside noise. You're there to dominate, to impose your will on the game, and to be the best version of yourself. That's the mentality. That's the difference. When you line up against another team, it doesn't matter who they are. It doesn't matter if they're your friend, someone you respect, or someone you grew up watching. In that moment, they're the opponent. You want to beat whoever is sitting on that other bench, no matter what. It's that simple. You look across the court, and there's this intensity, this hunger that builds up inside you. You want to win so badly that everything else fades away. The crowd noise, the expectations, the pressure, it all becomes background. All that matters is the game, the moment, and the opportunity to prove yourself. And for many players, especially those who grew up dreaming about this stage, it means even more. There are memories tied to it, late nights watching international tournaments, waking up early to catch Olympic Games, imagining what it would feel like to wear that jersey and represent something bigger than yourself. For a lot of athletes, those dreams start when they're just kids. Sitting in front of the TV, watching legends compete, thinking one day, that's going to be me. So when that moment finally comes, when you actually step onto that stage, it's not just another game. It's the realization of years of work, sacrifice, and belief. Making a debut at 24, standing there in that uniform, hearing the crowd, feeling the energy, it's not just exciting, it's an honor. A real, genuine honor that never gets taken for granted. But as special as those moments are, there's always another side to the story, the reaction, the commentary, the noise that follows. And that's where things can get frustrating, confusing, and, honestly, disappointing. Because instead of celebrating greatness, instead of appreciating what's happening in front of everyone's eyes, people find ways to turn it into something negative. That's exactly what we're seeing right now, and it's something that needs to be talked about. Welcome back to Basketball Fan, where we keep it real about everything happening in the game. And right now, there's a lot going on that just doesn't sit right. It's honestly frustrating to watch. The WNBA just secured a new CBA deal, something that should be celebrated across the board. That's a huge step forward for the league, for the players, and for the future of women's basketball. More money, more opportunities, more growth. That's what everyone has been asking for, and now it's here. But instead of focusing on that progress, instead of acknowledging how big that moment is, people have already shifted the conversation into negativity. No games have even been played yet. Nothing meaningful has happened in terms of the season itself. The only thing we've seen is a glimpse of what's coming, a preview of the future. And in that preview, one thing stood out clearly: Caitlin Clark stepping onto the international stage and performing at a high level, ultimately earning Team USA MVP honors. That should be a moment of celebration. That should be a moment where fans come together and appreciate what they're witnessing. But instead, social media erupted in the worst way possible. People started crashing out. And not just a little bit, completely losing perspective. Instead of recognizing the performance, instead of looking at the numbers, instead of acknowledging what was actually accomplished, the conversation turned into accusations, complaints, and outright hate. Suddenly, the narrative shifted away from basketball and into something else entirely. And that's where the problem begins. Because when you strip everything down and look at the facts, the numbers tell a very clear story. Caitlin Clark didn't just win MVP by accident. She didn't win it because of hype or popularity or any outside factor people want to bring into the conversation. She earned it. Plain and simple. The stats back it up. The impact backs it up. The eye test backs it up. She was right at the top of the team in scoring, either leading or tied for the lead in points per game. She led the team in assists, which shows not only her scoring ability, but her ability to create for others and elevate the entire team. Her efficiency was off the charts, leading in true shooting percentage. That's not just about volume, it's about effectiveness. It's about making the right plays, taking the right shots, and maximizing every opportunity on the court. When you combine all of that, it paints a picture of a player who is not only productive but dominant in her role. And yet, despite all of that, the reaction from some corners of the basketball world has been nothing short of ridiculous. Instead of acknowledging those numbers, instead of engaging in a real conversation about performance, people have chosen to ignore the facts and push narratives that don't hold up under any real scrutiny. That's where the frustration comes from. All of a sudden, people who never showed interest before are acting like die-hard supporters of other players. Overnight, social media is filled with individuals claiming that someone else should have won MVP, as if they've been following every game, analyzing every stat, and breaking down every possession. But the reality is, that's not what's happening. It's not genuine support, it's reactionary criticism. Take the comparison that's been floating around. When you actually look at the numbers side by side, it becomes clear very quickly. One player scored 51 points, the other had 50. That's essentially even. But then you look at assists, 25 compared to just 5. That's not a small difference, that's a massive gap in playmaking and overall impact. Rebounds are even. Shooting from three-point range shows strength on both sides, but again, when you factor in everything, scoring, playmaking, efficiency, the overall contribution leans heavily in one direction. So the question becomes, what are we really talking about here? What is the actual argument? Because if it's based on performance, the case is clear. If it's based on impact, the case is even clearer. The only way the argument exists is if you ignore the numbers entirely and focus on something else. And that something else is where things start to get uncomfortable, because it reveals a deeper issue within the conversation around the game. Instead of celebrating players for what they do on the court, the focus shifts to narratives, biases, and unnecessary divisions. That doesn't help the game grow. It doesn't help the players. It doesn't help the fans. All it does is create noise. And the irony in all of this is that the league itself is growing. The attention is increasing. More people are watching, more people are talking about it, and more opportunities are being created. The new CBA is proof of that growth. The financial improvements, the increased visibility, the expanding audience, it's all connected. And like it or not, a big part of that attention is coming from players who are bringing new eyes to the game. That's not a bad thing. That's not something to be resented. That's something to be embraced. Because growth benefits everyone. When more people tune in, when more fans engage, when the spotlight gets bigger, it lifts the entire league. It creates more opportunities for every player, not just one. It raises the standard, increases competition, and pushes the game forward. But instead of recognizing that, some people are choosing to focus on tearing down rather than building up. Instead of appreciating the moment, they're trying to discredit it. And that's where the disappointment comes in. Because at the end of the day, the truth is right there on the court for everyone to see. And no amount of noise, no amount of criticism, and no amount of narrative can change that. Hi, I'm Caitlin Clark, and whether people want to admit it or not, I've played a role in making the league bigger, bringing more eyes to the game, and helping elevate the conversation around women's basketball. And honestly, that should be something everyone can appreciate. That should be something that unites fans instead of dividing them. But somehow, even a moment like this, winning an MVP on an international stage, turns into chaos. It turns into arguments, accusations, and people completely losing their minds over something that should be simple. A player performed at a high level, the numbers backed it up, and the award followed. That's how sports are supposed to work. But instead of just letting that happen, instead of letting a player have her moment, the noise starts immediately. Welcome back to Basketball Fan, where we break things down without the nonsense, because what we're seeing right now is exactly that nonsense. People aren't even pretending to be objective anymore. The moment the MVP announcement dropped, the reactions flooded in, and instead of talking about basketball, people jumped straight into narratives that don't hold up when you actually look at what happened on the court. You've got people shouting, "Oh, she only won because the league is racist," and it's like, what are we even doing here? Seriously, what are we talking about? That argument doesn't even survive 5 seconds of real analysis. Because when you look at what's actually happening, it starts to feel like projection more than anything else. The same people claiming everything is about race are the ones constantly bringing race into every single conversation. Meanwhile, the majority of fans, people who actually watch the games, who follow the sport, who care about the competition, they're looking at one thing: performance. They're watching a player step on the court and hoop at an elite level. That's it. That's the conversation. But for some people, that's not enough. They can't accept that reality, and instead of adjusting their perspective, they double down on narratives that create division. And the truth is, the numbers don't lie. They never have, and they never will. When you break down the performance, it's clear. The scoring was there. The playmaking was there. The efficiency was there. The overall impact on the game was undeniable. This wasn't a situation where someone barely edged out the competition or where the decision could go either way. The case was strong, the production was consistent, and the result made sense. That's what makes the reaction so wild, because it's not rooted in basketball, it's rooted in something else entirely. At the end of the day, the MVP was deserved. That's not an opinion, that's a conclusion based on everything we saw. And the only truly crazy thing about this situation is how many people completely lost their minds over it. It's honestly been something to watch. In some ways, the meltdown has been almost as entertaining as the basketball itself. You scroll through social media and it's like a highlight reel of bad takes, emotional reactions, and people arguing against facts that are right there in front of them. Then you start seeing specific claims pop up, like Ryan Howard should have been MVP, and again, it's not about disrespecting Ryan Howard because she's a talented player. She can hoop. Anyone who actually watches the game knows that. But suddenly, overnight, everyone becomes a die-hard supporter, acting like they've been riding with her from day one. And that's where it gets comical, because it's not genuine. It's reactionary. It's not about lifting someone up, it's about tearing someone else down. And when you actually compare the performances, the argument falls apart. The scoring was essentially even. 1 point difference. That's not a gap, that's a tie in terms of impact. But then you look deeper. The assists tell a completely different story. One player created for teammates at a high level, setting up opportunities, controlling the flow of the game, dictating pace. The other didn't have that same level of playmaking impact. Rebounds were even. Shooting had its own strengths on both sides. But when you combine everything, scoring, passing, efficiency, overall influence, the picture becomes clear. So again, what are we really arguing here? Because if the conversation is about basketball, there's not much to debate. The only way this becomes a debate is if you ignore the full context and focus on isolated points that don't tell the whole story. And that's exactly what's happening. Now let's talk about another angle that people keep bringing up: the financial impact, the growth of the league, the attention it's getting. There are comments floating around saying things like, the union just signed the Caitlin Clark stimulus package, and while that might sound exaggerated or even sarcastic, there's a layer of truth behind the idea that certain players bring more attention to the game. That's not new. That's how sports have always worked. Star players drive viewership. They bring in fans. They create moments that people want to watch. And right now, whether people like it or not, WNBA is experiencing growth. More people are tuning in. More conversations are happening. The spotlight is getting bigger. And that's a good thing. That's what everyone has been asking for. More recognition, more respect, more visibility. And when that starts to happen, it should be embraced, not criticized. Because growth benefits everyone. It's not a zero-sum game. One player gaining attention doesn't take away from another player, it adds to the overall ecosystem. It creates more opportunities, more revenue, more exposure for the entire league. That's how progress works. But instead of seeing it that way, some people treat it like a threat, like something that needs to be challenged or torn down. And that brings us back to the core issue, the inability of some to simply recognize greatness when it's in front of them. For some reason, There's resistance to the idea that a young player from Iowa can step onto the biggest stages and dominate. There's resistance to the idea that someone can come into the league and immediately have an impact, both on and off the court. And instead of confronting that resistance, instead of asking why it exists, it gets masked behind other arguments. You hear things like, people who talk about race all day are the ones actually focused on race, and while that's a complicated conversation, there's a point to be made about how often the focus shifts away from the game itself. Because when the conversation becomes more about identity than performance, something gets lost. The game gets lost. The competition gets lost. The appreciation for skill, effort, and execution gets lost. Now, that doesn't mean there aren't real issues in sports or society. Of course there are. But not every moment, not every award, not every performance needs to be turned into a larger debate that ignores the actual context. Sometimes, a great performance is just that, a great performance. And that's why moments like this should be handled differently. Instead of immediate backlash, there should be analysis. Instead of accusations, there should be discussion. Instead of tearing down, there should be recognition. Because at the end of the day, sports are supposed to bring people together. They're supposed to create excitement, passion, and appreciation for what athletes can do. But right now, we're seeing the opposite in some areas. We're seeing division where there should be unity. We're seeing negativity where there should be celebration. And that's something that needs to change if the game is going to continue growing in the right direction. Even the reactions from content creators and commentators have added another layer to this whole situation. You've got people going live, breaking things down, calling out what they see as ridiculous takes, and in some cases, they're not holding back at all. They're pointing out the inconsistencies, highlighting the contradictions, and basically saying what a lot of fans are already thinking. The energy in those discussions shows just how passionate people are about the game, but it also shows how quickly things can spiral when emotions take over. There are clips circulating, reactions being shared, and entire segments dedicated to addressing what some are calling meltdowns. The language might be exaggerated, the tone might be intense, but the underlying point is clear. This situation has gone beyond a normal sports debate. It's turned into something bigger, something louder, and something far more chaotic than it ever needed to be. And yet, through all of that noise, the reality remains unchanged. The performance happened. The numbers were recorded. The award was given. Nothing about that changes based on social media reactions. Nothing about that changes based on opinions that aren't backed by facts. The game doesn't rewrite itself because people disagree with the outcome. So where do we go from here? That's the real question. Because moments like this are going to keep happening. As the league grows, as more attention comes in, as more players step into the spotlight, the conversations are only going to get louder. The reactions are only going to get stronger. And the challenge will be finding a way to keep the focus on what actually matters. That means staying grounded in the game itself, watching the performances, understanding the context, appreciating the skill and effort that goes into every possession. It means being able to celebrate greatness, even if it's not coming from the player you personally support. It means being able to have real discussions without immediately jumping to extremes. Because at the end of the day, this is bigger than one player, one award, or one moment. It's about the direction of the game. It's about how it's covered, how it's discussed, and how it's appreciated. And if the goal is to see women's basketball continue to rise, to reach new heights, to gain the respect it deserves, then the conversations around it need to reflect that. So as we wrap this up here on Basketball Fan, the message is simple. Let the players play. Let the performances speak. Let the numbers tell the story. And most importantly, let moments of greatness be recognized for what they are, without unnecessary noise, without forced narratives, and without losing sight of what makes the game special in the first place. Because when you strip everything else away, when you remove the distractions and focus on the court, the truth is always right there. And no matter how loud the outside world gets, that truth doesn't change. When you really sit back and look at what just happened, it almost feels surreal. You're talking about a player, Caitlin Clark, who is only 24 years old and has already stacked up accomplishments that most athletes spend an entire career chasing. averaging a little over 11 points per game along with around 6 for assists per game on an international stage is not something you just brush off. That's production, that's impact, and more importantly, that's leadership. And somehow, despite all of that, we're not just talking about her performance, we're talking about controversy, outrage, and people completely losing perspective over an MVP award that was earned on the court. Welcome back to Basketball Fan, where we break it all down, because this situation right here says a lot more about the state of the conversation than it does about the player herself. Think about it for a second. At 24 years old, most people are still trying to figure things out. They're navigating life, careers, responsibilities, and everything that comes with early adulthood. If you really ask yourself honestly, what were you doing at 24? Were you dominating on a global stage? Were you leading a team against elite competition? Were you earning MVP honors against some of the best players in the world? For the vast majority of people, the answer is no. And that's not a knock on anyone, that's just reality. Achievements like this are rare. They're special. They represent a level of dedication, talent, and mental toughness that very few people ever reach. And yet, instead of acknowledging that, instead of appreciating what it takes to perform at that level, we've got people reacting in ways that can only be described as over the top. The reactions aren't just critical, they're emotional, exaggerated, and in many cases, completely disconnected from what actually happened on the court. It's like people aren't even watching the same game. It's like the performance itself doesn't matter as much as the narrative they want to push. Scrolling through reactions, you see comments that try to disguise themselves as reasonable takes, but the moment you read them closely, the tone shifts. You'll see something like, "I swear I'm not trying to be a hater," and right there, you already know what's coming next. Because when someone has to start their statement like that, it usually means the opposite. It usually means they're about to say something that's driven more by emotion than by logic. And sure enough, that's exactly what happens. Claims start flying, accusations that she only made it because of media pressure, that she's somehow guaranteed a spot regardless of performance, that external factors matter more than what she does on the court. And then it escalates even further, with people throwing around extreme language, bringing in topics that have nothing to do with basketball, and trying to reshape the narrative into something it simply isn't. At that point, it stops being about the game entirely. Because let's be clear, none of those claims hold up when you actually look at the facts. You don't average double-digit points and lead your team in assists at an international level by accident. You don't win MVP awards, multiple MVP awards, just because of media pressure. That's not how sports work. Coaches, analysts, and decision-makers are looking at performance. They're looking at impact. They're looking at who is actually influencing the game in real time. And when all of those factors point in one direction, the result follows. But instead of engaging with that reality, some people choose to go in a completely different direction. They start questioning everything except the basketball itself. They'll talk about background, they'll talk about narratives, they'll talk about anything they can pull into the conversation, but they won't talk about the actual game. And that's the frustrating part, because the game is where the truth is. The game is where everything is decided. There's also this growing trend of trying to discredit achievements by minimizing when they happened. You'll see arguments like, "Oh, her success came when the games were already decided," or "it didn't really matter because the outcome was clear." But that doesn't hold up either. Anyone who understands basketball knows that every possession matters. Momentum shifts, runs happen, and players who can control the game, whether it's through scoring or playmaking, are the ones who stand out. You don't just stumble into those moments. You create them. And then you have the comparisons. Suddenly, other players are being brought into the conversation, and again, there's nothing wrong with comparing performances. That's part of sports. But the way it's being done here feels less like analysis and more like deflection. It's not about genuinely evaluating who played better. It's about finding a way to argue against a conclusion that's already supported by the numbers. Take Rhyne Howard, for example. She's a talented player, no question about it. She can score, she can stretch the floor, and she's proven herself at a high level. But turning her into the centerpiece of an argument against someone else's MVP case doesn't actually strengthen the argument, it just shifts the focus. Because when you look at the full picture, scoring, assists, efficiency, overall impact, the gap becomes clear. It's not about one stat. It's about the total contribution to the game. And that's something that keeps getting lost in all of this. Basketball isn't just about points. It's about creating opportunities, controlling tempo, making the right reads, and elevating your teammates. A player who can do all of that consistently is going to stand out. A player who can influence the game in multiple ways is going to have a stronger case for awards like MVP. And that's exactly what we saw. Now let's talk about the reactions themselves, because that's where things really take a turn. You've got people going as far as suggesting that games are rigged, that outcomes are predetermined, that everything is part of some larger plan. And at that point, it stops being a debate and starts becoming something else entirely. Because if you're claiming that the games themselves aren't legitimate, then what are we even discussing? What's the point of analyzing performances if the assumption is that nothing is real? That's why it feels so chaotic right now. The conversation isn't grounded. It's not based on shared understanding or common facts. It's scattered, emotional, and in some cases, completely detached from reality. And for fans who just want to enjoy the game, who just want to watch great players compete, it becomes exhausting. Because at the end of the day, it really is simple. A player stepped on the court, performed at a high level, and earned an award. That's it. That's the story. Everything else is noise. Everything else is people adding layers that don't need to be there. And yet, that noise keeps getting louder. The first thing some people jump to isn't the performance, it's identity, background, anything they can use to frame the conversation in a different way. It's like the basketball itself becomes secondary, and that's a problem. Because if we can't focus on the game, if we can't evaluate players based on what they actually do on the court, then what are we doing? The reality is, some people just can't accept that a player is as good as she is. That's what it comes down to. They can't accept the skill level, the confidence, the impact. And instead of acknowledging it, they look for ways to explain it away. They look for reasons that fit their perspective, even if those reasons don't align with the facts. But here's the thing, none of that changes the outcome. None of those arguments, none of those reactions, none of that noise takes away from what was accomplished. The performance happened. The stats are recorded. The award is given. That's reality. And as the game continues to grow, as the WNBA continues to gain attention, moments like this are going to become more common. More players will step into the spotlight. More performances will be analyzed, debated, and discussed. And the challenge will be keeping those conversations grounded in what actually matters. That means focusing on the game. It means appreciating skill, effort, and execution. It means being able to celebrate greatness without immediately turning it into a controversy. Because if every achievement becomes an argument, if every award becomes a debate filled with noise, then something important gets lost. So here on Basketball Fan, the message stays the same. Watch the game. Look at the numbers. Understand the impact. And most importantly, keep the conversation rooted in reality. Because at the end of the day, basketball is about what happens on the court. And no amount of outside noise can change that.